In 2019, Port Saline, a small seaside town in the south of France, enjoyed a slow-paced rhythm of life. Here, time seemed to stand still. The sun's rays warmed the cobblestones of the old streets, seagulls circled above fishing boats, and the scent of the sea blended with the aromas of coffee and freshly baked pastries. Among the town's residents was Alice Duval, a 68-year-old widow who had lived by a stable and predictable routine for the past 10 years. Every morning, Alice left her house on Rue Bonport and headed to her favorite cafe, La Vie Blanche. She ordered a black coffee with a croissant, took her usual corner table, and observed the town's life. Friendly nods and brief conversations with neighbors and friends filled her day with light social interaction. Afterward, she visited the market for fresh vegetables, returned home, and spent her evenings reading books or watching old movies. This routine had become her norm, though it was increasingly burdensome. Since the death of her husband, Gerard, a fisherman, Alice had gradually grown accustomed to solitude. Yet despite appearances of a full life, an emptiness inside her grew day by day. Gerard's passing had not only taken away her life companion, but also her sense of purpose. The peace and stability she once valued had become the walls of her prison. One warm autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alice sat in her living room under an old lampshade casting a soft yellow glow. Her eyes scanned the pages of a novel, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She set the book aside and opened her laptop. Her fingers nervously tapped the keyboard. A random search led her to an adult dating website. Alice froze. The screen lit up with bright photographs, smiling strangers, and the promise of new connections. At first, she wanted to close the tab, but something stopped her. She had never allowed herself such impulses before. Her heart pounded, her cheeks flushed. She felt curiosity and a secret desire awaken within her. What if she could feel alive again? What if a new acquaintance could help her break free from her routine trap? Alice spent the next hour browsing profiles and reading descriptions. Each story reminded her that there was life beyond her home. She felt a hunger for communication, attention, and emotions she hadn't felt in years. Her hands trembled as she created her own profile. A photo, a brief description of her interests. Everything was neat and reserved. She entered a false age, subtracting a few years, and clicked Save. Alice Duval had no idea that this step would be the first in a series of events that would change her life forever. She simply longed to escape the emptiness, not realizing how far this desire would take her. Alice Duval sat in front of her computer screen, carefully examining her new dating profile. She had chosen the pseudonym Marianne and listed her age as 55. The photograph she uploaded was flattering. She wore a modest suit with light makeup and a subtle smile. The reflection on the screen seemed to show someone else, a woman who still had energy and a desire to live. Her profile was restrained, yet mysterious enough to spark interest. She wrote about her love of art, walks along the seaside, and French classical music. Everything appeared proper, but between the lines lay a hidden need for attention and emotion. For the next few days, Alice checked the site with nervous anticipation. She received short messages from men her age, but none of them inspired her to continue the conversation. She was on the verge of losing hope when a new message arrived. It was from a young man named Jules Martin. Jules was a 28-year-old interior designer from Lyon who had recently moved to Port Saline with his wife Lily. His message contained no cliches or flattery. He wrote about the weariness of routine and how hard it was to feel useless when a loved one had drifted away. Alice felt his words resonate deeply with her own thoughts. She replied almost immediately. Corresponding with Jules became a window into a world she had long forgotten. They exchanged thoughts about books, movies, and life. Jules impressed her with his openness and sensitivity. Alice was aware that he was 40 years younger, but it no longer mattered. His words made her feel significant and interesting. She began to look forward to his messages every day. Jules also found refuge in their conversations. His marriage to Lily had long since become mere cohabitation. Lily, a successful journalist, was frequently busy with work and travel. Jules was left alone with his doubts and insecurities. Alice became the one who listened without judgment. A week later, Jules suggested they meet at Café Saint-Louis, near the waterfront. Alice hesitated, gripped by fear. She knew that stepping beyond virtual communication was a threshold from which there would be no return, but her inner voice urged her to take the chance. The day of the meeting arrived. Alice prepared carefully. She chose a modest yet elegant dress, styled her hair neatly, and applied light makeup. In the mirror, she saw a woman who wanted to be liked. It was a nearly forgotten feeling. She arrived at the cafe a little early and chose a table by the window. When Jules entered, her heart fluttered. He looked slightly nervous, but his gaze was warm. They greeted each other, sat down, and the conversation flowed as naturally as in their letters. This meeting was the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. Alice Duval's meetings with Jules Martin became a ritual that filled her life with new colors. They met once a week in various places, small cafes, parks, and waterfronts where the sea breeze refreshed their faces. Jules shared his dreams, creative ideas, and disappointments. Alice confided her memories of youth, her outlook on life, and thoughts she had never even shared with her late husband, Gerard. These conversations brought her to life. She felt needed, interesting, a woman who could still captivate. One warm April day, while sitting on a cafe terrace, Jules told her he wanted to show her a new project. He was working on the interior design of a restaurant in an old building near the beach and invited Alice to see it. She agreed, though a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. This was more than just a meeting. It was a step onto the thin line between friendship and something that couldn't be called just friendship. When they entered the half-empty building, where the paint was still drying and the windows overlooked the endless blue sea, Alice felt a wave of excitement wash over her. Jules stood close by, his voice soft and confident as he described the design. But she wasn't hearing his words. She was acutely aware of his presence, the scent of his cologne, and the warmth of his body. It was dangerous. It was thrilling. The next day, still under the spell of the previous afternoon, Alice went to the market. She tried to return to her usual routine, but every small detail reminded her of Jules, his words, his smile, the way he looked at her. Passion was blooming in her mind, a passion too young for her age and too risky for her life. During this same period, Alice met Mathieu Leclerc. It happened by chance. During lunch at a small bistro, she struck up a conversation with the 30-year-old chef. Mathieu was a weary man with sad eyes who spoke about his wife Veronique, a woman devoted to her career who neglected their home life. In him, Alice saw a reflection of her own loneliness. Their conversation stretched long, and Mathieu suggested they meet again. Their meetings soon became regular too. Mathieu brought her new dishes to taste, and she shared her life experience. Her attention, support, and tenderness became the solace he desperately needed. With Alice, Mathieu felt he could breathe freely again. Alice found herself at a crossroads. Two young men, two lives, two risks. She knew her actions could have consequences. These relationships were fragile threads stretched between passion and danger, but she could no longer turn away. Her once empty days were now filled with anticipation, adrenaline, and anxiety. This was a path from which there was no turning back. By the summer of 2019, Alice Duval's double life was becoming increasingly fragile. Her secret meetings with Jules Martin and Mathieu Leclerc had transformed from occasional encounters into regular ones. These relationships brought a sense of purpose to her life that she hadn't felt in years. Yet with each new meeting, the risk of discovery grew ever more apparent. Jules Martin, the 28-year-old designer, was experiencing a crisis in his marriage to Lily, an ambitious journalist. Her frequent business trips had led to emotional distance between them. However, Lily's intuition did not fail her. She began to notice changes in Jules's behavior. He came home later and later, avoided direct eye contact, and became overly protective of his phone. His excuses about work sounded increasingly unconvincing. Observing this, Lily concluded that Jules was hiding something. At the same time, 30-year-old Mathieu Leclerc, a chef at a small bistro, was also changing his habits. His wife, Veronique, who was engrossed in her own business, didn't immediately notice the shift. But eventually she realized that Mathieu was staying late at work without clear reasons. His stories became inconsistent, and the exhaustion in his eyes gave way to nervousness and confusion. Lily and Veronique, acting independently, began their search for the truth. Lily installed a tracking app on her husband's phone, determined to confirm her suspicions before taking action. Veronique, on the other hand, began checking Matthew's expenses, receipts, and work schedule. Their findings gradually formed a grim picture. Alice Duval also felt the mounting pressure. Her behavior became increasingly cautious. Before each meeting, she would carefully look around to make sure no one saw her. Yet Port Salan was a small town where any unusual behavior quickly became the subject of gossip. Her neighbors were already whispering about her late walks and uncharacteristic activities. Alice's mood grew tense. She realized that her relationships with Jules and Matthew were built on shaky ground. One misstep, one accidental encounter with someone familiar could destroy everything. Fear crept into her eyes, and her heart tightened at the thought that the world she had created could collapse at any moment. By midsummer 2019, suspicions loomed like storm clouds. One evening when Jules returned home, Lily watched him silently, her gaze filled with determination. She was close to exposing him. Veronique also refused to let her suspicions go unanswered. In her mind, a plan for a direct confrontation with Mathieu was forming. During this time, Alice tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy. She continued visiting cafes and the market, but her actions felt mechanical. Inside, she was painfully aware that her secret was on the verge of becoming public knowledge. The situation had reached a boiling point. Every step the characters took was saturated with anxiety and the expectation of the inevitable. The tension grew unbearable. The boundaries of deception were stretched to their limit. The question was no longer if the truth would come out, but when and what consequences it would bring. By the end of the summer of 2019, the tension had reached its peak. All the fragments of the secret lives of Alice Duval, Jules Martin, and Mathieu Leclerc were beginning to form a complete picture, one that could no longer be hidden. The suspicions that had built up in Lily and Veronique solidified into certainty. The truth was imminent, and control over the situation was slipping away with each passing day. Using the tracking app, Lily discovered that Jules had spent several hours in an area where he had no reason to be. During one of his late returns home, she silently pulled out a suitcase and began packing his things. When Jules walked through the door late that evening, he was met with silence and his wife's cold gaze. She held the phone in her hand, the screen glowing with a map of his route, leaving no room for explanations. "Where were you, Jules?" Her voice was calm, but laced with barely suppressed rage. Jules remained silent, unable to find the words. The wall of lies he had carefully built for months was starting to crumble. Lily could no longer contain her anger and pain. Her quiet resolve exploded into an outpouring of betrayal, loneliness, and humiliation. That same evening, Veronique found a receipt in Matthew's pocket from a cafe they had never visited together. The date and time matched when he was supposed to be at work. Her patience snapped. With a cold, unwavering voice, she told him she knew about his lies. Her words, filled with disappointment and anger, fell like a sentence. Matthew couldn't deny it. His shoulders slumped as he realized he had lost. Alice Duval felt the catastrophe approaching. That night, she sat in her darkened living room, staring at her reflection in the window pane. The image of an older woman desperately trying to reclaim lost youth and warmth looked tragic. She realized that her attempt to escape the monotony had led to the inevitable collapse of not only her life, but also the lives of two young families. The next morning, news of the confrontations in the Martin and Leclerc households quickly spread through the town. Port Saline thrived on gossip, and this time the rumors were particularly venomous. Neighbors whispered about Alice, who had now become a symbol of forbidden and destructive desire. People she had greeted for years at the market or in cafes now turned away when they saw her. Jules and Mathieu faced the anger and pain of their wives. Lily filed for divorce, while Veronique packed Mathieu's belongings and asked him to leave. The emotional explosion shattered their illusions, leaving emptiness behind. The secrets were out, and now everyone had to face the reality they had tried to ignore. Alice's attempt to revive her life had ended in disaster. All that remained was to watch the pieces of the past fall to the ground, shattering the existence she had once known. After the truth about the secret relationships of Alice Duval, Jules Martin, and Mathieu Leclerc became public knowledge, the town of Port Saline was swept up in a storm of gossip. The residents, who had always lived a measured life where everyone knew each other, found the scale of this scandal incomprehensible. Each revelation of betrayal only added fuel to the fire. Jules Martin, once a promising designer, now faced the consequences of his actions. His wife Lily, having filed for divorce, wanted nothing more to do with him. His professional reputation was in jeopardy. Clients who had heard about his role in the scandal canceled their projects with him. People saw him not just as an unfaithful husband, but as someone who had destroyed trust and wrecked a family. Mathieu Leclerc, the chef, faced a similar fate. His wife Veronique did not forgive his betrayal. After she left, Mathieu fell into a state of deep emptiness. He tried to maintain his job at the bistro, but his reputation had been ruined. Customers avoided his establishment, and profits declined. The once cheerful man had become a shadow of his former self. Alice Duval bore the brunt of the town's condemnation. To the people of Port Saline, she was no longer the polite widow who visited the market and exchanged friendly greetings. Now she was the woman who, in their eyes, had sown discord and destroyed young families. Her former friends avoided her, and neighbors looked away when she passed. Her once peaceful home now felt like a prison cell. Under the weight of this judgment, Alice realized that her choices had been a desperate attempt to escape loneliness. She had wanted to revive her life, to fill the void left by her husband's death. But this attempt had backfired, causing pain to others and resulting in her social exile. The police began investigating the circumstances surrounding the conflict between Jules and Lily, trying to determine if their confrontation had escalated to physical violence. Public condemnation was now mixed with the fear of legal consequences. The town lived in anticipation of new revelations, with each detail emerging like debris from a sunken ship. Alice watched as everything she had tried to build fell apart. Each day was filled with bitterness and regret. She no longer left the house. The streets she once walked with joy now felt hostile. She stared out the window, listening to the whispers about her downfall outside her walls. Jules and Mathieu also struggled to come to terms with their actions. Both realized that their desire for change and freedom had led to disaster. They searched for a way out of their traps, but their choices had been made, and the consequences were now inevitable. Each of them carried the burden of responsibility for the decisions that had changed their lives forever. After the revelation and the cascade of emotional explosions, the lives of Alice Duval, Jules Martin, and Mathieu Leclerc lay in ruins, like the wreckage of a ship scattered along the shore. Port Saline was slowly recovering from the scandal, which had forced its residents to reconsider how well they truly knew each other. The whispers and gossip gradually died down, but the wounds left by this story lingered. Alice Duval realized there was no longer a place for her in the town. The friends with whom she had once shared daily joys and struggles now treated her as an outcast. At the market, the vendors served her in silence, avoiding eye contact. The streets of Port Saline, which had once been a cozy home, now felt cold and hostile. In every glance, she read judgment and disdain. Her decision to leave the town came quietly, without drama. She packed the essentials and sold the house where she had spent most of her life. Jules Martin, after his divorce from Lily, moved back to Lyon, hoping for a fresh start. His professional reputation was tarnished, and his personal life was in shambles. In the anonymity of the big city, he tried to disappear into the crowd and begin again. Yet guilt and remorse haunted him. He often thought back to those moments with Alice, which had seemed so real at the time, but now felt like a strange illusion that had cost him everything. Mathieu Leclerc also tried to rebuild his life after Veronique left him. His small bistro closed due to a lack of customers. Realizing his past was holding him back, he moved to the north of France and found work as a chef in a large restaurant. There, he tried to forget his mistakes, but the shadow of his broken marriage and betrayal followed him everywhere. Veronique and Lily worked to heal from the pain of betrayal. Veronique focused on her career, avoiding any mention of Mathieu. Lily returned to her work as a journalist, using her experience as motivation to push forward. Both women turned their suffering into strength, determined to rebuild their lives. Alice settled in a small town in western France, far from Port Saline. She found a job at a local library, spending her days surrounded by books and silence. Here, no one knew her story. She remained polite but kept her distance from deep connections. In her new life, there was no room for risk or adventure. She chose to live quietly, knowing that any attempt to escape loneliness could lead to disaster once again. The story of Alice, Jules, and Mathieu served as a cautionary tale for Port Saline. The town quickly returned to its usual routine, but the memory of the scandal lived on. It was a reminder of how hidden desires and discontent could destroy lives. Though the story faded from daily conversation, it left a scar on the town's collective memory, a silent warning about the fragility of human relationships and the consequences of secret choices.